right, brilliant. So, content clearance for games. I thought I would introduce myself before I dive in. My name's India. I'm a trainee solicitor at Wiggin. I'm part of the interactive entertainment team. We're one of the largest kind of media and interactive entertainment law firms in Europe. And I joined there as part of a merger with another law firm called Pure and Partners, who specialize exclusively in video games. Before that, I worked at Miniclip, who are probably best known for having a really large gaming website. It's one of the world's largest privately owned gaming websites. Yep, I'm an avid gamer, like most of the other speakers. Love deck building games like Hearthstone, MOBAs like HOTS, and the masterpiece that is Zelda Breath of the Wild. So big fan. And a bit more context about Wiggin and some of the studios that we work for. We work for kind of big, well-known names like CD Projekt Red, Epic Games, Riot Games. We also work with indie clients like Nordeus, Biffle Games, No More Robots. And we also do work with streamers like the Yogscast and influencers. We do some esports work as well with Fnatic. So moving on to what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to basically be doing some kind of do's and don'ts for what to include in your game. It might sound a bit overly negative, but I apologize because I'm a lawyer. So some of the topics I'm going to be covering, things like Easter eggs, celebrities, real buildings, products, symbols, and what I kind of deem to be risky content, but I'll discuss that in later detail in a minute. So firstly, Easter eggs. What are Easter eggs? If you don't know already, they're like hidden features or surprises in games. They come in many different shapes and sizes, and they have very different risk levels. So when you're including an Easter egg in your game, you should think very carefully about what the risk is and who the owner of the intellectual property is, because some can be particularly litigious. You should also check your contracts, because often publishers or partners will require for you to have specific conditions around Easter eggs, like either not having them at all or having like sign off for every single Easter egg that's in your game. And if you do choose to include Easter eggs in your game, keep a record of where they are, because if you have to remove them, this can be quite an expensive and timely fix, and it's just better to know where they are so you can remove them if you have to. I've put some examples here. There's both of them from Borderlands. On the left, you can see there's an allusion to the double rainbow viral video, which you may have heard of. I'd say this is much lower risk. It's very unlikely that the owner of the YouTube video is going to come after Gearbox for this, and also you can't really protect a natural occurrence like a rainbow by intellectual property rights. That's a low risk Easter egg. And on the other hand, you can see there was a Minecraft creeper in Borderlands as well. That's much higher risk. Mojang and Microsoft could come after Borderlands for including their direct assets in the game. So yeah, that's just an example of kind of the different risk levels of Easter eggs and what to consider when including them. So moving on to symbols. What do I mean by real symbols? This is kind of recognizable icons, logos, flags, and signs. You can use pre-existing symbols in your game, but you'll 99% of the time will have to get a license. And the best practice is to just create your own symbols in-house. Another thing to be particularly careful of when you're including symbols in your game, like flags, is rules around advertising. The UK has very specific rules around using like flags and icons in advertising. There's rules like not using them to cause offense and not using them to imply any kind of endorsement. So I've got two further examples here. First one's Prison Architect, who actually got in trouble for breaching the Geneva Convention because they included like a red cross on their ambulance. And because of that, they had to go in the game, remove all the references to red crosses on their ambulances. Again, like a very timely and costly fix. So you want to be very careful when you're thinking about what symbols you include in the game. Are they protected by any intellectual property rights? The second example is the Aboriginal flag. Contrary to what most people would think, you think it would be owned by the Australian government, free to use. That's actually not the case. It's actually owned by a private individual, and it has to be licensed for use. There was a lot of controversy around the fact that it's not kind of in the public domain, and I think the Australian government are currently considering taking back the ownership of that so that it can be used freely. It's not the case at the moment, so it's something to keep in mind when you're using symbols in a game. Very similarly with real products, what I'm talking about when I'm referring to real products are just things existing in real life. McFlurry, Ferrari, a gun. So the same thing applies to real products. You can't just use them freely in games. They're often protected by intellectual property rights, especially things like logos and designs of products. For example, on the right-hand side, you can see a gun. This is made by the manufacturer Glock. They're pretty well known for being very litigious. They had 11 trademark infringement suits against 20 companies over the last 15 years. So they're very keen to protect their IP. Despite this, you do see product placement in games. You do see real products in games. And a good example of this on the left-hand side is Death Stranding. Those of you who've played it, there's loads of advertisements for Monster Energy and Norman Reedus' TV show. So it can be done, but it has to be licensed carefully. The use of each real-world product has to be licensed, and these licenses often, the brand owners often put very, very specific controls on how you can feature the products. Like, for example, car manufacturers, usually when you're getting a license to put a car in a game, they'll have very specific provisions on how the car can depict damage. So that's something else to keep in mind. Moving on to what I consider to be risky content. So this covers anything from kind of offensive content, adult material, controversial content, and you should think very carefully about using risky content in games for a number of reasons. The main two reasons, in my opinion, are PR implications and regulatory implications, things like how it affecting your game's age rating. So one person's version of what's acceptable may be very different from another person's. There are definitely some very strong PR implications to consider when putting risky content in your game. For example, GTA on the left-hand side is quite widely criticized for being, well, not criticized, but it's very popular in the media for its controversial content, things like drugs and nudity and violence. And this is definitely why GTA has got an extremely high, or highest age rating it could get, which is 18 plus. So a very small reference to what is a mature topic can change your age rating from universal to 18 plus immediately. And DayZ is a very good example of this. So in DayZ, it was originally refused classification in Australia because you could use cannabis as a healing item. And this actually, they had to remove all the references to cannabis entirely just to get the game to get a rating so it could be released in Australia. So I think now it's been released with a 15 plus rating. So again, more things to consider when you're including risky content in your games. You should think carefully about the PR implications and the impact that it can have on your game's age rating. So I've summarized some golden rules on using third-party content in your game. I think you shouldn't use third-party content in your game without at least considering if you're allowed to use it. You should always make sure that you've got written agreements in place with every single person that's contributed to the game or is featured in it. And if something feels too close to the wire, it probably is. I think it might have actually skipped 2 slides, so I'm going to go back and see if I can grab these. Yeah, that's odd. Okay, sorry. So before you consider those golden rules, there's 2 other topics I was going to cover. The first one's celebrities. You also can't just use anyone who you want in games. People's likenesses and their images, they're protected by intellectual property rights. And the risk gets higher and higher the more famous the person is, like a politician or a movie star. You're very likely to get in trouble here. The golden rule is don't use people's images and likenesses without their permission. Give very serious consideration to who you're putting in the game. So on the left-hand side, you can see No Doubt and Activision Blizzard. This is quite an interesting case. So No Doubt licensed to Activision Blizzard the right to use their image as avatars in Band Hero, but it was only to use their image for songs that they'd sung. And then it turned out that you could use like Gwen Stefani's avatar on a song by the Rolling Stones. That was outside the scope of their license. They sued Activision Blizzard and they won the case. So it's very important to stay within the license terms that you agree. And also you can see on the right-hand side pictures of a famous footballer whose name I'm not going to butcher. So this is a recent thing that's come up. Around 300 professional footballers are actually reportedly considering suing Electronic Arts for using their images in FIFA without their permission. So again, it kind of demonstrates the licensing complexities and the risks involved when you're using celebrities or politicians or anyone famous in your game. And I think there was one more slide that was missing. And this was on, there we go, a couple of just FAQs that I thought people might want to know that we get asked about just when you're using assets from the internet. So a common question we get is, can I just use a font that I found on the internet for my game? The answer, of course, is maybe. Fonts are often copyrighted, and the licenses do have to be reviewed by legal before use, usually, because there are often some kind of prohibitions on whether you can use it commercially or if you have to credit someone in a certain way. So you have to be quite careful with font licenses, but there are free font licenses out there. It's just something that has to be checked by legal first. And the second point was about using images from search engines like Google Images. We usually advise against doing this. It's quite risky, very risky. And perhaps a better way to go about it is using images from stock image sites. Often they're subject to licenses as well, and they should be checked thoroughly before using them. But the safest thing, of course, is just using images for source material and inspiration and creating your own assets in-house. So I think that's everything. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.